The American Enterprise Institute presents the Distinguished Lecture Series on the Bicentennial of the United States. Our host for this thought-provoking series is Vermont Royster, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with the Wall Street Journal and professor of journalism and public affairs at the University of North Carolina.
I'm Vermont Royster with another in the American Enterprise Institute's Distinguished Lecture Series on the American Bicentennial. 1976 marks America's 200th birthday. There have been, there still are, and there undoubtedly will be many setbacks. But the American experiment has withstood the test of time. It's a success. The American Enterprise Institute, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research institution based in Washington, feels that what our founding fathers had in mind at the time of the Revolution is still important to Americans today. In order to explore this connection between our heritage and our present, the AEI has invited many of the nation's leading scholars to share with us their views on the American Revolution and how it still applies today. Today's lecturer is Dr. Leo Marx, literary critic, intellectual historian, and professor of English and American Studies at Amherst College. Dr. Marx delivers his lecture from the University of Virginia at Charlottesville. He will speak on the American Revolution and the American landscape, both of which are well represented at the University of Virginia. The university was founded and designed by Thomas Jefferson in 1819. Jefferson laid out the school to be what he termed an academical village. Around a large lawn, Jefferson placed 10 pavilions connected by student dormitories. At the north end, Jefferson designed a rotunda, which is a smaller and somewhat modified version of the Pantheon in Rome. The dome of the rotunda was destroyed by fire in 1895, but is now being restored for the American Bicentennial. The central point in Jefferson's academical village concept is the lawn, or what is called the quad on several other campuses. Each of the 10 pavilions surrounding the lawn was based on a different classical style of architecture. It was Jefferson's idea that the different styles would familiarize students with the basic forms of classical architecture. Originally, professors were to live and teach in the pavilions, and today a few honored professors still live there. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of the grounds at the University of Virginia are the so-called Serpentine Wall, which enclose the gardens around each pavilion. The walls were designed by Jefferson for both their beauty and their strength. Since the walls are only 1 brick thick, the curve of the design strengthens and stabilizes the entire structure. The ingenious Mr. Jefferson made additional use of the curved design. Since certain plants require less sunlight than others, the curved shadows cast by the walls provide varying amounts of shade, providing the proper amount of sunlight for the different types of plants in the garden. The major academic building on the ground is Cobo Hall, which was opened in 1899. It was designed by architect Stanford White. Cabell Hall houses a major auditorium, which is the site of today's lecture by Dr. Leo Marx. Dr. Marx is introduced by Dr. Robert D. Cross, Dean of the University of Virginia's Faculty of Arts and Sciences.
Tolstoy once made a crucial distinction between thinkers who were hedgehogs and those who were foxes. And Isaiah Berlin, applying this distinction to historians, concluded that he was a hedgehog who had one big idea, while the fox abounded in what one called insights and tricky historical maneuvers. I'm not enough of a biologist to declare exactly in which category to place our speaker today. This evening, I would grant him qualifications in both categories. Every so often, an enormously important book emerges, and such was our speaker's book, The Machine in the Garden, technology, and the pastoral ideal in American life, in America. But it's in the best sense a foxy book as well as a hedgehog book. Its implications are not only immediate, but long run. They're not only profound, but profoundly pertinent. Leo Marx is not bound by any terrain or any dogma, but to the application of intelligence, insight, and some very big truths indeed. I am pleased to present my former tutor, present friend, and after he speaks, I'll decide whether I still agree with him, Professor Leo Marx, Professor of English and American Studies at Amherst College.
Thank you, Robert. You said you were getting your own back, is that it? Ladies and gentlemen, although the subject I have been invited to discuss this evening is unusual, it may not strike you as wholly unfamiliar. I say it is unusual because we do not ordinarily think of landscape as having political consequences. A landscape, after all, is an image of topography. Does it make any sense to attribute revolutionary force to a topographical image? How would it acquire such force? To my knowledge, no political philosopher ever has addressed himself to these questions. But though the subject seems unusual when considered in the abstract, simply as a concept, the actual title of tonight's lecture, The American Revolution and the American Landscape, sounds familiar. If anything, it has a conventional schoolroom air about it, like an idea of revolution that we learned in the first grade, along with the words, "To America the Beautiful." The oddity of the concept of a revolutionary landscape seems to fade when we specify the American Revolution and the American landscape. To indicate what I mean, suppose for a moment that we are not now assembled in Charlottesville, Virginia, in a university designed by Mr. Jefferson, but in Paris, in a setting designed, say, for Louis XIV. And suppose that the revolution we are preparing to celebrate is not the one that began on the village green of Lexington, Massachusetts in April 1775, but rather the one that began at the Bastille in July 1789. Is it conceivable that we would have gathered here to discuss the French Revolution and the French landscape? I think not. The point is that our subject not only is peculiar, but, as we used to say with more pride than we can muster nowadays, peculiarly American. This is not to deny that the French mind, like that of any self-conscious people, has in a degree been shaped by the place it inhabits. As Americans, however, we seem to be particularly receptive to the idea of the native landscape as having had a special influence upon the formation of our national identity. The reason is obvious. From the time they first saw the New World, Europeans conceived of it symbolically as a possible setting for a new beginning. It is the unique tangibility of this ideal landscape, so unspoiled, so rich, so beautiful, that accounts for its exceptionally powerful hold upon the native imagination. This fact is reflected in the work of all our classic American writers: Cooper, Emerson, Thoreau, Hawthorne, Melville, Whitman, Mark Twain, Frost, Faulkner, Hemingway, where the landscape is no mere setting or backdrop, but an active shaping ingredient in the consciousness of men and women. If our writers are correct, the landscape is an important clue to the understanding of American thought and behavior. Let me illustrate with a familiar example, F. Scott Fitzgerald's fable, The Great Gatsby, which is enjoying an immense vogue right now. As it happens, in fact, the new film version of Gatsby, the third film to be made of the novel, is having its first showing in New York this evening. Today, we tend to read Gatsby as a tragic fable, written in the peculiar hybrid mode of pastoral romance developed by American writers. But it also can be read, interestingly enough, as a kind of mystery story. I want to call your attention to the mystery and to the remarkable device that Fitzgerald uses to dispel that mystery as a clue to the relation between landscape and revolution in America. The story is told, you will recall, by Nick Carraway, a young man from Minnesota who comes east in the spring of 1922 to make his fortune in Wall Street. The novel turns on Nick's effort to understand the behavior of his legendary, mysterious neighbor, the former James Gatz of North Dakota. To Nick, Gatsby represents, as he says, everything for which I have unaffected scorn. What he scorns is Gatsby's vulgar display of wealth, his ostentatious parties on that blue lawn, the burnished cream-colored car with its burgeoning appurtenances, not to mention his ruthless, even criminal methods of getting rich. And yet, Nick cannot help admiring the man. Above all, he admires Gatsby's single-minded devotion to one ideal, his absolute commitment to winning back Daisy, his first love. It is the man's extraordinary gift for hope, his belief in the possibility of erasing the past, the 5 years since his rhapsodic affair with Daisy, that leads Nick to tell Gatsby finally, "You're worth the whole damn bunch put together." But the truth is that until the very end, Nick is unable to make up his mind about the man. He cannot fathom that mysterious blend of moral obtuseness and idealism. And so all through the summer he wavers between feelings of revulsion and admiration. It is only when the summer is over, after Gatsby has been murdered, that Nick finally discovers the missing clue. Just before going back to Minnesota, his trunk packed, he returns to the shore near Gatsby's house. It is evening, and in the moonlight he sees the landscape as he imagines it once had appeared to arriving Europeans. And only then does he find an explanation for Gatsby's contradictory and self-destructive behavior. Most of the big shore places were closed now, he says, and there were hardly any lights except the shadowy, moving glow of a ferry boat across the Sound. And as the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away, until gradually I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh green breast of the New World. Its vanished trees, the trees that had made way for Gatsby's house, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. What this extraordinarily resonant passage implies is nothing less than a theory of the origins of the American character and, by extension, of our national behavior. It says that what happened to Gatsby, how he came to be the man he was, and his eventual fate, can only be understood in the light of the special way that Europeans perceived the New World. The sight of an unspoiled, unstoried green continent nurtured certain propensities of thought and action which are still operative 5 centuries after Columbus's first landfall. It is important to notice also that Nick describes that flowering landscape, back of the vanished trees, as having pandered to the dreams of his prototypical American. With that one devastating word, Fitzgerald quietly insinuates a criticism of the dream which the landscape evoked.
We are watching Dr. Leo Marx discussing the American Revolution and the American landscape. Dr. Marx's thesis is that the native landscape of America has had a special influence upon the formation of our national identity. In just one moment, Dr. Marx continues. While many students at Virginia and other universities often spend a midnight dreary while they ponder week and weary, the student who did it in this room was the author of those lines, Edgar Allan Poe. Fittingly, Poe had room number 13. Poe wrote to his foster father that he'd paid $15 for the room as rent, and then he spent another $12 for his bed and $12 for the room furniture. Today, the poll room is maintained as it was in the 1800s as an exhibit on the university grounds. We now return to Dr. Leo Marx, who is speaking not far from this room.
If there is anything distinctive about the American experience of the land, it is the brevity of our tenure and the fact that we often made the land a commodity before using it as a habitation. The land was ours, in Robert Frost's words, before we were the land's. So far from having a particularly enduring, affectionate attachment to the places we inhabit, Americans probably are the least rooted, the most casually nomadic of modern peoples. Moreover, the nation's record as a user of forests, grasslands, wildlife, and water sources in the 19th century is, in the judgment of one historian, the most violent and the most destructive of any written in the long history of civilization. No, the unique significance of the landscape in the American consciousness is not to be confused with reverence for the land as such. Rather, as Fitzgerald understood, its significance is chiefly symbolic. It is a central feature of our myth of national origins. According to that myth, it is the landscape that invited Europeans to disengage themselves from a constricted social environment and to begin a simpler, freer, more fulfilling life in the unstoried terrain of North America. When Nick gazes at the shore in the moonlight, when he imagines how it looked to the first Europeans, he suddenly recognizes the origin of Gatsby's, quote, heightened sensitivity to the promises of life. Like Columbus or the Dutch sailors, or the millions who followed them, Gatsby believed that tomorrow, any tomorrow, we shall erase the past and begin a new life, the sort of life that only exceptional wealth, beauty, and freedom can provide. If Americans have a peculiar inclination to experience the world in this way, it is because the idea of a new beginning once had, or at least seemed to have had, such a credible basis in topographical fact. That unspoiled, unstoried continent once had been there, a tangible landscape of limitless possibilities, and it informed everything that Europeans did when they came to America. To Europeans, the most important physical attribute of the American landscape probably was space itself, real, open, seemingly boundless space. It is worth recalling that the beginning of interest in landscape as a subject, exemplified by the painting of landscape for its own sake, coincided with the age of exploration. Before that time, European art and literature seems to reflect a sense of being hemmed in, confined to old, used, closed spaces. When the idealizing imagination of Europeans had taken flight, it had tended to move in time rather than space. Such dreams of felicity as we identify with the Golden Age, or Eden, or Arcadia, draw most of their vitality from their location in time. It is their temporal distance, their pastness, rather than a particular topography that gives these ideal worlds most of their power. And a similar point can be made about the future-oriented utopias of the Renaissance. But the availability of space outside of Europe, and particularly in the hospitable climate of North America, changed all that. Here was usable space that enabled Europeans literally to act out the most ancient primordial urge to get away, to take a trip, and to begin life again in an unspoiled landscape. When Tom Paine wrote Common Sense, late in 1775, he had been in the colonies for only 1 year, yet that most effective of revolutionary pamphlets is drenched in a similar kind of topographical awareness. The Reformation, Paine writes, was preceded by the discovery of America, as if the Almighty graciously meant to open a sanctuary to the persecuted in future years when home should afford neither friendship nor safety. In addition to the seeming emptiness of American space, hence its availability as an asylum for the oppressed, Paine emphasized the monumental dimensions of this virgin landscape. Throughout, he writes, as if there were some necessary affinity between greatness in size, the sheer extent of the continental terrain, and the greatness of the American cause. I quote, The sun never shone on a cause of greater worth. 'Tis not the affair of a city, a county, a province, or a kingdom, but of a continent, of at least 1/8 part of the habitable globe. It is worth noting, incidentally, that the words continent and continental became more and more popular with the Americans as their revolutionary fervor increased. When the delegates for the first Congress assembled in Philadelphia in September 1774, they did not refer to that body as the Continental Congress, but that is how it came to be known, along with continental currency and the Continental Army and so on. The mere verbal identification of the revolutionary cause with the huge North American landmass was a source of courage and hope. It obviously was reassuring for John Adams to write, in another letter to his wife, a curious sentence like this one. I quote, "The continent is really in earnest in defending the country." There is a certain pathos, it seems to me, along with the unmistakable brag, about the popularity of the word continent. Here, after 150 years, were these spokesmen for this thin line of colonial settlements, still largely confined to a narrow strip along the eastern seaboard, describing themselves as an entire continent in revolt. It was not difficult for a brilliant polemicist like Paine to invest the American landscape with revolutionary significance. In Common Sense, he repeatedly translates indisputable geographical facts into arguments for independence. I quote, "'Tis repugnant to reason," he writes, "to the universal order of things, to all examples from former ages, to suppose that this continent can long remain subject to any external power. Reconciliation is now a fallacious dream." Like Franklin, Paine loved to taunt the British with their presumptuous smallness. "There is something absurd," he writes, "in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island." Topography, after all, reveals those laws of nature to which the Declaration will appeal as a sanction for revolution. "In no instance," Paine wrote, "hath nature made the satellite larger than its primary planet. And as England and America, with respect to each other, reverse the common order of nature, it is evident that they belong to different systems, England to Europe, America to itself." A large part of what Paine meant by common sense is a simple environmentalism, the assumption that a man's interests inevitably are determined by the place he inhabits. "It is folly to argue," Paine writes, "that Americans should accept the royal veto because British subjects living in England accept it." I quote, "England being the king's residence, and America not so, makes quite another case. The king's negative here is 10 times more dangerous and fatal than it can be in England, for there he will scarcely refuse his consent to a bill for putting England into as strong a state of defense as possible, and in America he would never suffer such a bill to be passed."
Dr. Leo Marx has been discussing the effect of the landscape of America upon our development as a nation. In just one moment, Dr. Marx will return. Students at Virginia are surrounded by some examples of outstanding statuary on the gardens of the university. This statue, entitled Homer and His Young Guide, was done by Sir Moses Ezekiel, and so was this rendering of Thomas Jefferson. The Jefferson statue was cast in Rome and presented to the state of Virginia by the sculptor. Jefferson stands on a replica of the Liberty Bell, and the figures surrounding the bell represent liberty, justice, religious freedom, and human freedom. The beautiful grounds of the university form a fitting backdrop for our AER lecturer, Dr. Leo Marx, who is discussing the American Revolution and the American landscape.
Turning now to the second attribute of the American landscape, its seeming timelessness, I want to suggest how it also contributed to the idea of a revolutionary new beginning. But the spatial and temporal characteristics of the landscape lent credibility to the cause of revolution in precisely opposite ways. The vast forests, mountains, rivers, prairies, and plains of North America provided tangible images of boundlessness. They provided real objects for the representation of ideal space. But that same undeveloped landscape divested time of its usual landmarks. Compared to the terrain of Britain and Western Europe, with its cities, roads, monuments, and ruins, the American landscape was unmarked by the usual traces of history, or at least what the white men of Europe considered to be history. The fact that Indians lacked a written record of the past was one of the many reasons that Europeans assigned them to the realm of wild nature or savagery rather than to human civilization. During the Revolutionary era, Americans often referred to their country as an asylum, by which they meant a sanctuary from the forms of constraint and repression inherited from the past. It was a landscape that invited epithets like unstoried and immemorial, words that indicate how this place carried the mind beyond the usual limits of memory, tradition, and history. It was a terrain that mutely turned thought from the past to the future. It implied that the grip of the past upon the present is not a fixed condition of human existence, and that a fresh start is always possible. By 1776, this potentially radical idea had been translated into a specific program for dissolving the political bands which connected Americans to the past. It issued in a revolutionary act of separation. But if the unstoried landscape reinforced the separatist or centrifugal aspect of the revolution, it also lent an impetus to its political corollary, the idea of founding an entirely new republic. A landscape untouched by history inevitably had aroused fears of lawlessness, and the instinctive response of many Englishmen was to go back to first principles and establish a new political order. A large part of the success that we claim for the American Revolution can be attributed to the fact that it took place in an undeveloped landscape. Most revolutionary movements, no matter how much they have aspired to anti-authoritarian ideals, have had to struggle against entrenched power and authority. And in the course of the struggle, they often have been compelled to recreate the kind of centralized power they initially had repudiated. But in large measure, the old order against which the American revolutionists were fighting was across the Atlantic. Besides, the very newness of the colonies tended to diminish the influence of the wealth, status, and power that some Americans had acquired by 1776. Hence, the American Revolution was won without generating the kind of class hatred, fanaticism, absolutism, and violence that often has undermined revolutionary idealism. Unlike the French, Russian, or Chinese revolutionists, the Americans did not have to build their new order on the ruins of an old one. Even at the time, the Americans understood why theirs had been a particularly fortunate revolution. When a group of French officers who had fought beside the Americans were embarking for their return to Europe, one Bostonian issued this warning, I quote, "Do not let your hopes be inflamed by our triumphs on this virgin soil. You will carry our sentiments with you, but if you try to plant them in a country that has been corrupt for centuries, you will encounter obstacles more formidable than ours. Our liberty has been won with blood. You will have to shed it in torrents before liberty can take root in the old world." The third attribute of the North American landscape that contributed to the revolutionary spirit, along with its spatial and temporal character, was the promise of economic fulfillment. To gaze upon what Columbus called those very fruitful fields, admirably adapted for tillage, pasture, and habitation, was to imagine an escape from the chronic scarcity which Europeans had assumed to be a permanent fact of life. In Jefferson's language, the unique thing about America was, and I quote, "the lovely equality which the poor enjoy with the rich." Our term middle class lacks the resonance of this 18th century middling concept. For the men of the Revolution, it had moral, cultural, and political, as well as economic implications, and they all were figured forth by the image of a terrain midway between a decadent Europe and a savage frontier. The Republic of the Middle State was to be an almost pastoral society of small property holders, men who would be satisfied to fulfill the austere neoclassical ideal of economic sufficiency. It is this moderate sensibility which distinguishes the revolutionists of 1776 from those who staged most other revolutions. No other revolution has been fought by men in so little danger of real deprivation, or so unprovoked by the injustice of people living lives of luxury within sight of desperate poverty. Just as the American landscape represented freedom from constraint in space and in time, it represented the scarcely credible possibility of freedom from want. But of all the implications of the American landscape which nurtured the revolutionary spirit of a new beginning, the most profoundly effective, if also the most elusive, was philosophical. Here I refer to the capacity of the landscape to represent the concept of nature itself. When Europeans journeyed into the wilderness to establish new communities, they were beginning again, returning to nature in a quite literal sense. And when, in 1776, the Congress voted to declare the independence of the colonies, they faced the issue of beginning again in an abstract, political, and philosophical sense. How would they justify breaking the law and resorting to violence? This was the bedrock philosophic issue with which the Congress confronted the Committee of Five, Messrs. Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Sherman, and Livingston, when it directed them to draw up the official Proclamation of Independence. In effect, these men were asked to provide a reasoned case on behalf of behavior which they themselves would have described, not long before, as criminal. They were asked to justify acts which they knew would be regarded by many of their contemporaries as treason and murder. But the fact is that they had very little difficulty in marshaling their arguments. They announced to the world that they were entitled to make a revolution, to alter or abolish the existing government by, in the familiar yet seldom understood phrase, the laws of nature and of nature's God. This is not to suggest that the idea had emanated directly from the native landscape, or that Mr. Jefferson had plucked it like some ideological flower from his garden. But it was ready at hand, as everyone knows, in the language of the natural rights philosophy so effectively propounded by John Locke almost a century before. To justify an unlawful seizure of power, Locke had asked Englishmen to suppose a hypothetical situation in which they found themselves living outside of politically defined social space in what he called a state of nature. His brilliant notion was that when we try to imagine such a return to nature, we are more likely to see the purpose of government in proper perspective. We then recognize that government is not a natural necessity like air, food, water, clothing, or shelter. Men form governments for self-protection, and it follows, therefore, that governments exist to serve men rather than the other way around. When a government ceases to provide that protection, men have a right, derived from their essential being, from that initial state of nature, to alter or abolish it. They have a natural right to organize a revolution. In making this argument, Locke came close to deifying the idea of nature, by which he meant a set of abstract principles or laws governing the universe and accessible to human reason. That such laws exist had been proven beyond all doubt by the astonishing discoveries of Galileo, Kepler, and Newton. Although science had discovered the physical principles of natural order and harmony, their political counterparts had yet to be fully apprehended, and it was to fill that gap that Locke offered his theory. But if Englishmen of the 18th century were responsive to the doctrine of natural rights, consider for a moment how much more it meant to their colonial relatives. For a century and a half, the colonists had been accustomed to thinking of themselves as living, if not in a state of nature, well then at a considerable distance from the centers of urbane civilization. Americans were indisputably, irrevocably provincials, and during the Revolution, they embraced that idea. The pervasive environmentalism of the age enabled them to make a virtue of provinciality. For after all, if thought and behavior is in large measure determined by the environment, and if the ultimate principles of order and harmony lie hidden behind the mask of nature, then an American obviously was far more likely to gain access to those principles than a Londoner or a Parisian. Thus, the American landscape effected a virtual religious conversion. When Englishmen set foot on American soil, said Crèvecoeur, they experience a kind of resurrection. They become new men. This idea accorded perfectly with the criticism of a corrupt society developed by disaffected Englishmen at home. Adapted to American needs, the standard viewpoint of the neoclassic and radical Whig social criticism meant that coarse native homespun, like provincial manners, was more natural, honest, and virtuous than imported silk or London coffee house sophistication.
Dr. Leo Marx has been pointing out that the American landscape, its vast open spaces, and its promise of abundance was one of the major reasons for the great migration here from Europe in the days before the Revolution. In just one moment, he will continue. In Edgar Allan Poe's day, the dormitory rooms, the ranges and pavilions that surround the great lawn at the University of Virginia were the customary living quarters for all the students. Today, those 109 rooms are considered a place of honor. They are occupied by graduate students, upperclassmen, honor students, and a select few others who have made some outstanding contribution to the university. Although all the rooms are centrally heated, each of the honor rooms has its own fireplace. Students enjoy using these original fireplaces and provide their own firewood, which is stacked neatly outside each doorway. Dr. Leo Marx is about to conclude his lecture with a warning about the ecology of America and the future of the American Revolution.
In America, as in Republican Rome, access to a more natural rural setting was thought to be conducive to sound, anti-monarchical views. At a time when Englishmen believed that the simple life, repose, and contemplation in the countryside helped to breed Republican manners, the American landscape inevitably was perceived as a seedbed of Republican virtue. What I have been trying to suggest is that the topographical awareness of Americans coincided with John Locke's philosophic argument on behalf of revolution. Even in the 17th century, he had had some glimpse of this truth. In the beginning, he wrote, "All the world was America." When Englishmen migrated, they in effect were approximating a return to that state of nature in which men are best able to perceive self-evident truth. The Lockean doctrine of natural rights thus provided a philosophical confirmation of a viewpoint that seemed to arise almost spontaneously from American soil. If the four attributes of the native landscape I have been discussing have a common significance, it is, most simply put, the idea of freedom from constraint. The apparent limitlessness of space, the seeming absence of history, the promise of abundance, the accessibility of nature's God, all of these were made visible, physically attainable, or so it seemed, by the American landscape. This was the green beacon that attracted millions of English and European migrants to the New World. The colonists who rebelled against Britain in 1776 were a self-selected population of men and women with a special responsiveness to the idea of a fresh start. Either they themselves or their ancestors had at some point been willing to leave an old, organized society and begin a new life in the fresh green terrain of the New World. In conclusion, and with the approaching bicentennial in view, I would like now to briefly consider what has happened to this myth of a political new beginning in the 2 centuries since the Revolution. To that end, I want to remind you once again of F. Scott Fitzgerald's image of the American landscape with which I began. When the narrator, Nick Carraway, imagines the old island that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, he goes on to say that the fresh green land pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of human dreams. With that one shocking verb, Fitzgerald, to repeat, insinuates a dark view of the fate of American idealism. To pander is to minister to base passions. In other words, the magnificent landscape has had 2 quite different effects upon the American consciousness. Initially, it fostered an inspiriting vision, like Gatsby's extraordinary gift for hope. And in 1776, That meant a revolutionary commitment to the idea of separation from England and the establishment of a more generous, free republic than any known to Europe. But at the same time, the landscape pandered to an illusion which has well nigh destroyed that hope, that revolutionary commitment, just as it destroyed J. Gatsby. Chance to get me a glass of water before I choke. To be more specific, consider the contradictory influences of the image of landscape as empty, boundless space. It inspired the men of the Revolution to create a society dedicated to the proposition, as Lincoln later would put it, that all men are created equal. But as it turned out, the same image ministered to self-serving, ethnocentric, and racist behavior. There was no place in that imaginary, unspoiled landscape for the Indians, who thus could be removed along with the trees that made way for Gatsby's palatial house. It is worth noting, incidentally, that it was a black American, Stokely Carmichael, spokesman for the civil rights movement of the 1960s, who reminded us of the unmistakably, if unconsciously ethnocentric history lesson we teach our children with the simple statement, Columbus discovered America. If there was no place in this myth of national origins for the Indians, neither was there one for the blacks, who came to the New World not in order to be more free, but to be enslaved. In practice, the more ample life for all people figured by American space was interpreted to mean a more ample life for men of white European descent. Thank you very much. By the same token, the sense of being out of historical time in America had both creative and destructive consequences. The image of a landscape unmarked by history lent an impetus to the revolutionary idealism embodied in the Declaration of Independence. But it also encouraged Europeans to entertain the illusion that when they crossed the Atlantic, they somehow purged their age-old tendencies toward aggression, domination, and conquest. It encouraged them to believe that in America they might create a classless, conflict-free, peaceful republic like the Edenic world that presumably existed before history began. There is a telling passage in The Great Gatsby when Nick tries to persuade Gatsby that he cannot expect Daisy simply to erase the 5 years she has been married to Tom Buchanan. I quote, "You cannot repeat the past," Nick says. "Cannot repeat the past," Gatsby cried incredulously. "Why, of course you can. I'm going to fix everything just the way it was before." This idea that it is possible at any moment to erase time, to recapture an ideal, untainted past, and to start again is traceable to the myth of national origins. It accounts for the often noted American propensity for strategies of denial or avoidance. When we have cut down all the trees on a piece of land or polluted a river or made a city unlivable, our native instinct often has been to move out and start somewhere else. A contemporary sociologist, Philip Slater, has named this habit of thinking, that is, the idea that complicated problems can be flushed away, the toilet assumption of American thought. It is a dangerous, self-deluding tendency, and one that has served to deflect attention, energy, and imagination from the complex problems that would have to be solved in order to make the ideals of the American Revolution attainable in our own time. So too the promise of abundance, symbolized by the American landscape, has had the unforeseen effect of diminishing revolutionary hope. The patriots of 1776 envisaged a society that might make possible, for the first time in history, freedom from want. They hoped to create a community distinguished by a relative equality of condition, in which none would be too rich or too poor. But in fact, the seemingly inexhaustible resources symbolized by the landscape gave rise to a quite different passion for an endlessly rising rate of economic production and consumption. Our natural wealth, indeed, has ministered to those very base passions, greed, selfish acquisitiveness, and wasteful luxury in the face of acute deprivation that the Founding Fathers identified with a decadent European aristocracy. A primary source of the disenchantment with a decadent, a primary source of the disenchantment with the American dream that informs our literature, and The Great Gatsby, for example, is Fitzgerald's savage portrayal of the narrow, self-serving mentality of the very rich in America. They were careless people, Nick says of Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness or whatever it was that kept them together and let other people clean up the mess they had made. But of all the base passions to which the landscape ministered, perhaps the most destructive has been our excessive belief in American differences. It was only a short step from the exhilarating revolutionary spirit, with its deep sense of America's exceptional good fortune, to an exaggerated and self-righteous view of the uniqueness of native virtue. As I noted earlier, the return of Europeans to a more natural environment, if not to that pure state of nature in which all truth becomes self-evident, often was regarded as providing access to ultimate, almost sacred meanings and values. In less pretentious terms, freedom from the constraints of European convention and scarcity made possible a new sort of person, more spontaneous, forthright, easy, good-hearted, or in a word, as we say, more natural than people elsewhere. Hence, any purpose adopted by Americans is likely to be perceived, like Jay Gatsby's purpose, as the following of a grail. The initial identification of the national consciousness with nature had the effect of sacralizing national aspirations. Although the attributes of the landscape encouraged Americans to believe they were creating a unique society marked by a new revolutionary conception of freedom and equality, they were, in fact, recreating many of those European conditions against which the revolution had been fought in the first place. As we approach the bicentennial celebration, it would be a mistake to deny all the ways in which the Republic of today falls short of the goals envisaged by Jefferson and his colleagues in 1776. If that green light at the end of Daisy's Dock is a sadly diminished emblem of what the New World landscape once had represented, so has our commitment to the ideals of the Revolution been diminished. For at least a century after 1776, the United States was the inspiration of people struggling for freedom throughout the world. But today, in many places, men and women with aspirations not unlike those of the patriots of 76 regard the United States as the enemy rather than the friend of revolutionary egalitarianism, and not without reason. Within this country, moreover, attitudes toward the concept of revolution also have changed. In recent years, the word itself has regained a measure of its appeal for numbers of disaffected Americans. Once again, some Americans, students, blacks, and others, are thinking about revolution as a feasible means of achieving political ends. But the significant fact is that they are contemplating a revolution directed against our own institutions, our own government. And so, all of these reflections bring me back finally to the way F. Scott Fitzgerald unlocked the mystery of Jay Gatsby's fate. It was from the landscape that Nick learned what destroyed Gatsby. In the end, he realized that the myth of national origins, which gave rise to those dreams of ecstatic fulfillment, also destroyed the dreamer. To be sure, the myth always had fostered illusions, but in the beginning, before settlement was completed, they had had a much more credible basis in fact. I quote, "And as I sat there," says Nick, "brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's Dock. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. And then, just here, in the pause between two sentences, Nick at last is able to explain the mystery of the failure of American hopes. He now knows something that Gatsby had not known, and that something has led to Gatsby's destruction. He did not know, says Nick of Gatsby, that it, the dream, was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. I take this to mean that the vision of possibilities figured forth by the American landscape, if it ever was achievable, was closest to realization when the Republic began. Since that time, we have neglected the responsibility of bringing it up to date, that is, of translating it into a language appropriate for a society that no longer has access to an unspoiled, unstoried landscape. In preparation for 1976, it is instructive to read The Great Gatsby as a cautionary fable. It may remind us why and how we have become distracted from our own generous revolutionary ideas, and it may yet encourage us to change direction and complete America's uncompleted revolution.
We have been listening to Dr. Leo Marx discussing the American Revolution and the American landscape. Dr. Marx's premise is that as Americans destroyed and diminished our natural resources, we have also diminished our commitment to the goals of the American Revolution. This lecture has been one in a series presented by the American Enterprise Institute, dealing with many aspects and many points of view regarding the American Revolution and its effect on all of us today. If you would like a copy of Dr. Marx's lecture or of the entire series, write the American Enterprise Institute, that's AEI, Post Office Box 19191, Washington, D.C. 236. Until next time, this is Vermont Royster. Thank you for joining us.